Welcome, everyone. It's good to be here today. I'm Josh Vanek with the Montana Campus Network for Civic Engagement, and welcome to the Centering Indigenous Knowledge series. We are a statewide network of colleges and universities that support civic and community engagement. And for the Centering Indigenous Knowledge series this fall, we are so excited to be participating in Native American Heritage Month and thank Carla for encouraging us in that direction and using this time of year to highlight Native American art and creative connections to tribal histories and culture. Today, we're so excited to have Terran Last Gun, whose art we've featured in our advertising materials and marketing materials in the past 2 years. And for future sessions, we've got Dylan Running Crane next week and Chris Latre for our final event on the 20th. The artwork that you saw on the screen when we first opened up the webinar was called Ilu Sacha, and that's by Stella Nall. You can look at her other work at stellanall.com, Nall. I do want to quickly thank our sponsors. Our presenting sponsor is Humanities Montana, and then we also thank RJS and Associates, Reach Higher Montana, Montana State University, Campus Compact, and the University of Montana. So if you're attending today, please know that it's because of them and their generosity helps this thing get off the ground. And if you have the wherewithal, we encourage you to make a donation directly to a tribal college in our part of the world. And now I want to hand it over to my colleague, Dr. Carla Bird from UM.
Thank you, Josh. Oki ni stu ni daniku nadu kayaki ni amskapi pikani. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining. My name is Carla, and I work in tribal outreach here at the University of Montana. And I actually wanted to start our webinar with a story because I have two really special elders that I've connected with, and there's a really great story of how we got connected. But those elders are Cal Williams and Kevin Mountain Horse. And Cal, he saw this flyer on Facebook and he contacted me and he said, I have some information, some knowledge that I wanted to share with you that you could present during the webinar. And this knowledge is Blackfoot-centric knowledge, and I thought it might be a great time and place, being that Terran and I are both Blackfoot members. Um, and so one of the terms when we think about Blackfoot traditional art, one of the terms that comes to mind in our language is gakiosin, and that has many interpretations. One of the most common interpretations is traditional knowledge, and when we talk to our elders, they talk about the value of using your instincts, your observation, when you're being transferred knowledge, right? And so, Cal mentioned that our traditional form of art as Blackfoot people was writing on the stone, which is thousands of years old. And there's actually a spot, a provincial park in Canada that's known as Writing on the Stone, and it's about a 30-minute drive north of Shelby. And what's significant there, that site is thousands of years old, but it was a warrior site where our warriors would retreat. And there was some depictions of actual writing that was on the stone. And what's interesting about that site is many people go there thinking that our Blackfoot people created this art. But in a Blackfoot worldview, they would go there to see spiritual writings. And so one of our Blackfoot words is known as muhkat, which is draw as art. In our world, art is a way to preserve stories. It's a way to preserve visions, and it's also a way to transfer knowledge and teachings. And there's another term, it's known as synapse, which is our mind is like a camera. And so when we think about our mind being a camera, it's capturing images. And so in some ways we're using that to observe, remember, and recreate. And so in our traditional form, art started with visualization. And that those visualizations were then transferred to stone, to buffalo hides, to lodge coverings, which Terran will talk about. Another word is ixenatsen, which is depicting story through painting, right? And so another example of that would be our winter counts. There we're depicting story through images. Um, Cal also told me about some of our traditional paints, and one of the main paint that we used was red ochre. And in our collections here on campus, we actually have a stone, and at the very end of the stone, there's still red ochre. And so some of our traditional paintbrushes were stone, and you'll see the red ochre. But also another traditional paintbrush was a buffalo hide wrapped around a stick. And so at the very end, you would use these traditional paints, which were made out of things in nature, right? And so our black paint was known as suki, and our black paint was made from burnt wood. So whatever part of a wood that wasn't burnt, that was left over, ashes, we were able to make paint the color of black. White clay paint was also used, and white clay paint was found along the hills. And this particular paint was used for piercing ceremonies or dancing. Um, and if you know about the Ani people, they're also known as the white clay people. And so the white clay is pretty significant to them as well. Gumanoi is our blue paint. It was actually made from bird droppings. Igitsi is a deep, darker toned paint. We also have Seven Star paint in Muxi, which is our sun paint. And so all of these items, all of these paints were made out of nature, and were natural paints. Um, so that's a little bit about what I wanted to share, but now I wanted to introduce Terran, and I'm so honored to introduce Terran. Terran's a Piikani visual artist whose work bridges ancient Blackfoot design traditions with bold expressions of modern abstraction. Terran was born in Browning, Montana. He's an enrolled member of the Piikani Nation, and which is one of four nations of the Blackfoot Confederacy. Collectively, we're known as the Niitsitapi, are the real people. He grew up on the Blackfeet Reservation and now lives and works in Santa Fe, New Mexico. Working across multiple media, Terran explores color, form, and abstraction inspired by the land, cosmos, cultural narrative, and lived experience. His art carries forward what he calls Piikani modernism, a continuation of Indigenous creativity that draws from ancestral ways of seeing and understanding the world. Terran's work has been exhibited across the country at venues such as the Anderson Ranch Arts Center in Colorado, the Missoula Art Museum, the Glacier Art Museum, the Newberry Library in Chicago, the Eighth Floor in New York City, Museum of the Plains Indian in Browning, the Contemporary at Blue Star in San Antonio, and the IA Museum of Contemporary Native Arts, which is where Tara and I first met when he was a student. Taryn holds a Bachelor of Fine Arts in Museum Studies and an Associate of Fine Arts in Studio Arts from the Institute of American Indian Arts, where he graduated in 2016. In his artist statement, Taryn reflects that color and shape are the building blocks of his practice, deeply connecting him to his Piikani heritage. His influences include Blackfoot painted lodges, hides, and war shirts, as well as archaeological sites and ancient imagery across Montana and Alberta. He draws inspiration from petroglyphs, pictographs, rocks, and glacial formations, interpreting them through a modern visual language, Through his art, Terran bridges the ancient and the contemporary, revealing fragments of time, history, and indigenous abstraction, an art form that has endured on this continent for thousands of years. His work is bold, vivid, and minimalist in form, yet profoundly rich in meaning, content, and place. So at this time, I'll hand it over to Terran.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Carla. I'm going to share my screen and we'll start my presentation. Okay. Uh, Okiniksukwaks. Nistuanokok Saakwaynaamah'kaa. Numahtu Piikani. Hello, everyone. My name is Terran Last Gun. My Blackfoot name is Saakwaynaamah'kaa, which means last gun. It was my great-great-grandpa Dick Kip's one of his Blackfoot names that was transferred to me when I was a young boy. And I consider myself a Piikani visual artist. I just want to take the time to thank Carla, Josh, and Danielle, and the Montana Camp for civic engagement for inviting me to be a part of this video series, the Centering Indigenous Knowledge series. And for the theme of this series, which is Native American art, creating connections to tribal histories and cultures, I thought that was just such a great theme to go with, and especially for me as an artist, this is for sure what my work has been about in terms of histories, cultures, and connections. And so, at the bottom of my first slide here, these were some phrases that kind of stood out to me when thinking about this presentation, but also what kind of are in my studio during when I'm creating. And so my creative journey, which I'll be going over today throughout my presentation, maintaining connections, either, through visual art forms or experiences of being back home with family and friends and on the land. And then geometric abstraction. That's what I do consider my work. And it's a Piikani geometric abstraction. And so those are what I'll be presenting today. I always like to start off though with letting people know where I come from. And so I'm a citizen of the Piikani Nation, also known as the Blackfeet Nation of Montana. We are part of the Blackfoot Confederacy, which includes three other nations, Siksika, Kainai, and the Piikani Nations in Alberta, Canada. You can see on this map here where the Blackfeet Reservation is, and then also where the other Blackfoot Confederacy nations, where their reserves are in Canada. And the outline, much bigger than that. That is our traditional territory. That is what we knew. That is where we went. That is where we roamed. You can see it includes a large portion of Montana, Alberta, and even Saskatchewan. And so I think about this a lot. I think about how much territory we used to be able to roam, but also how much was taken away. And my work reflects a lot of this land, not just specifically on my reservation, but our entire territory. And so I'm taking all of that into consideration. But I like to show this map just because it gives people a sense of my nation, how we're part of a larger confederacy, and where everyone is located throughout that. I was born and raised in Browning, Montana. That's the main town on the Blackfeet Reservation. That's where I grew up going to. I would say my first creative experiences was going to powwows. My mom and my dad really got me into dancing at a very young age. And what I still do and what I continue to do is men's prairie chicken dance. And so we have origin stories for that dance from the Blackfoot Confederacy. And in the powwow world, there's so much color involved and so much movement. You're dancing, you're performative. It's like this embodying something else. And so I think that's where my creativity really started, and color, my interest in color and how color interacts with each other is started with that dancing at powwows. Um, and so the next slide here, briefly, my education prior to coming, so this is the Institute of American Indian Arts. Prior to coming to I was at the Blackfeet Community College, where I graduated with an AS in environmental science. But from there, I really was wanting to think about how can I take our history, our objects, is how can we support those? And because a lot of these are in different collections across, the world, our country, Canada, United States, but also in other parts of the world. And that's what got me to go to IAI. My dad had attended IAI and he knew of this museum study program. And so my journey started in 2011 at IAI. And that's really the place that got me into thinking about art and art history and how, I Western art is such a big topic and is in our faces all the time. But when we try to like look at our own tribal histories and our own Blackfoot art history, that's where I started to do more investigation, more research, and wanted to know more about Blackfoot art history and what was that. And so they always encouraged us to, in my classes, to look at our own cultural backgrounds and where we come from and our art forms. And growing up in Browning and on the res and going to various powwows that are on our reservation, would see these painted lodges. And I would always wonder what these are. Um, and so I really became so fascinated with them and just learning about them and meeting actual lodge owners. And so for the Blackfoot Confederacy, we not everyone would have a painted lodge. If there was a camp of 300 lodges, 10 of them would be painted and they're transferred. And they're painted with in historic times they were painted with natural pigments, which Carla had talked about, finding these colors throughout our landscape, throughout nature. And they could be broken up into like three tiers. So the bottom represents the land, the middle represents an animal or whatever helper those owners, the owners of that lodge, that middle part could be an helper to them, guidance. Usually animals, sometimes weather elements, sometimes just various types of figurative depictions. And then the top is like the cosmos. And so there's a lot of polka dots on the top. There's the Big Dipper, the Pleiades, Morning Star, the sun, the moon, so the constellations are how we're connected to the cosmos. And so to me, these have always been a great learning tool, not only as an artist, but just as a somebody who's very much interested in Blackfeet history, Blackfoot history. These lodges really hold our worldview. And so I've always been inspired by these, and in particular the geometric symbols. So at the bottom, the triangles, those represent mountains. The mounds, they represent hills, and then the flat, just polka dots, but the flat line above them, that could represent the plains. And so this lodge here to the left, that's the horse lodge. The next one to it, to the right, is the snake lodge. The one next to that, I believe, is an elk lodge. And these were owned by, a couple it would be transferred to a couple and they would take care of it. And it's not just an art piece on this large canvas cover, but it almost becomes alive, at least to me. I think of these as like, family bundles. And so they're very special and to me, classic art of the Great Plains. Here's one more example I wanted to show. This is the Antelope Lodge to the right here. You can see the hill symbols on the bottom. You can see the lines on the top, which sometimes, it really depends on the owner and their stories connected to the lodge, their interpretations. And so the lines at the top of the lodge, those could represent trails. If it was a water animal, it could represent ripples and water. It just really depends on the owner and This is a great picture just because it shows the Big Dipper constellation, the seven stars. The one lodge in the back has a cluster of stars. And so just representing, to me at least, the cosmos, the above world. And in the far, far back, you can see a train in the back of the image. And all of these photos were taken by Walter McClintock, who came to my reservation, to our land in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and took hundreds of photos. And so these live on. These are what inspire me today is these archival photos. They're just beautiful images of, but also they show change. They show colonization. They show these wagons, the train, invasion, really, and coming through our land, encroaching. And so there's so much to this photo, to his photos that he took. But again, the painted lodges have always been a huge inspiration to my art, and you'll see that throughout as I continue. So I finished an II in 2016. My background while I was attending II in terms of art was printmaking. I really took interest in printmaking and focused on that in terms of courses I was taking. And so here to the left, I have a lot of my screen prints. That's the technique I was really interested in terms of printmaking techniques. There's so many of them. But screen printing it's a really a quick medium. It's acrylic inks and you're using archival printmaking paper and it's a really fun medium and new medium at that time that I was working with. And also I started to think about how can I enlarge my work. And so I started to incorporate murals. And you can see that this is a mountain design from our lodges using the polka dots, playing with color, playing with scale. When I started to create work, I think I was being very literal to those lodges. And so it was like very much repetition of like a bunch of triangles, a bunch of mounds. Over time, and this was, I would say, the beginning of that, I started to focus on just a single shape and really play with that shape in different ways through color, through scale, and really playing with, with how can I give a new interpretation of our mountains, and how can I continue that on and thinking of continuum. So on the left here, you can see our mountain design. You can see a big sun circle. That was the sun for me, and the moon and morning star, their son, their child, their son. So I started to play with these shapes, thinking about our origin story, thinking about our landscape, and really just thinking about how Blackfoot people interpreted our surroundings in this sort of geometric way for hundreds, thousands of years. And so, this way of this abstract way of thinking about our world and our experience has been happening in North America, for thousands of years. And Blackfoot people, we were part of that, and I'm trying to continue that on. So this was in 2018. This was my first exhibit solo show, and this is at the II Museum of Contemporary Native Arts store gallery. That's called the Lloyd Kiva New Gallery, and it was a great start to trying to present work in an exhibit fashion. That was completely new to me. And so this is a work in my senior year, abstract landscape number one. I was really taking our mountain designs and working in them with different ways, placing them in different areas of the paper, always including the sun. I just feel, and for Blackfoot people, we're just so connected to the sun and the sky world and the moon and the celestial beings that surround us here on Earth. And so I really wanted to play with that and playing with color, looking at these different ways of color. And so this was the start of that abstract, trying to think about that. How can I play with abstraction? Here's a closer up of that hill image. It's called Rolling Hill. right where Browning is, we're located in the rolling hills. And so I was trying to continue to work with that hill shape, with those trail lines, the bands going across in the middle there, the sun and colors. When I was at II, I was very much interested in pop art. And so I think these colors in the beginning, I was really looking at these bright, vivid, saturated colors. And that continues on throughout my work. But at this time, I was really looking at primarily pop art. And this is the last serigraph I want to show, screen print. So on some of the lodges, there on the back side of them, there's this like doorway shape. It could be a rectangle, it could be more of like a mound looking type shape. And it represents many things for individual lodge owners. But I've always been drawn to that shape and thinking about doorways, thinking about window ways, and how they're sort of these access points to new areas. And for me, with 2D art, for new ways of thinking, imagining new ideas, thinking about old ideas, bringing them back to life. That's what I'm thinking of when I'm looking at these doorways and windowways. They're allow me to just think about different things. And so that's what I wanted to include in this serigraph print here. So by the time 2020 came, and that was really the pandemic, I was relying a lot on print shops after I graduated, and I didn't have the space or the equipment in my own studio space. And so the pandemic happened and it cut me off from all of these print shops I was utilizing. And I had a show coming up. This is the same place, II Museum of Contemporary Native Arts, that same gallery space. I got invited back in 2020. And so I really had to think quickly about what to present. And my father, who's a ledger artist, he gave me some ledger paper documents, and before the pandemic had happened, and I had been sitting with him for a number of years. He gave me colored pencils, and really that was my first time learning about ledger art as a medium and what is ledger drawings, what is ledger art. So I decided to use this opportunity, this solo show, to finally do ledger drawings. And just briefly, ledger art could be so much more talked about, but some of the earliest forms of ledger drawing are in the 1860s. They were incarcerated men, plains warriors. There's some really good examples out of Florida, Fort Marion, I believe it was. And, you know, prior to having access to paper and colored pencils, we were painting on hides, painting on lodge covers, painting on war shirts. And so once all of the hides, that material, the emu, the bison were nearly eradicated, we were forced on reservations. We didn't have access to a lot of the things we were used to using, and paper became a new source of material. And what they were doing really is recording and documenting, especially of that time. And so you see these documentations of changing environments, um, and throughout that. So in the beginning, it was a lot of ceremonial scenes, courtship, and then war scenes, hunting scenes, encountering the U.S. Army, on up to Indians in cars, motorcycles, trains. It has evolved throughout since 1860, since some of the first ones I've seen. And it's very much representational, very much figurative when you think of ledger drawing, historic ledger drawing. So you see a lot of horses, a lot of people, a lot of animals, actual representations of events. What I'm doing here, I'm taking a bit of a different approach. I'm thinking about how we used to interpret, or how we still interpret, mountains, our nature, stars in geometric form. And so that's what I've continued to do. I'm interpreting my surroundings in these new ways, and playing with color. And so this is one of the first works I did, which is Seeking New Energy. It's on this Miles City, Custer County, state of Montana document, um, ledger document that's dated 1934. This is all colored pencil. I'm using ink for the line work, and then I fill it in with colored pencils. My favorite colored pencil brand is Holbein, which is a Japanese colored pencil. It's very velvety and soft. And then I also like to use Faber-Castell, which is a German colored pencil. And both create just very beautiful colors like this, you know. And really, I'm thinking about when it comes to color. This is where I really started to think about the color wheel and playing with complementary colors, playing with primary, secondary, tertiary colors. And so, you know, the color wheel has 12 colors on it, and you can break it up in so many different ways to create color harmony. And so when ledger drawing started, I think that's when I really started to think about color in a much different way. And this is that archway, the doorway. You know, it's inspired by man-made doorways, but also natural arches and just what we see throughout our days. This one is titled Cosmic Dream World. This was in 2021. And another county tax type document. For me, I was really thinking about space maps, thinking about our cultural narratives that tie us to the sun, moon, and morning star, you know, the Big Dipper, the Pleiades, those stories of the lost children, and different sky stories. I was just really inspired and looking into these, and this is what I was starting to create. I'm playing with these circles, concentric rings, but throwing in polka dots and letting the viewer see through to the actual ledger paper. You can see the penmanship of the of that time. This is dated 1926. And you know, when it comes to the ledger documents I'm working with, I always find it fascinating to see the penmanship, um, because a lot of times it's cursive, and you know, cursive isn't very much used today. Everything's more digital. Um, and so yeah, it's very interesting to see these and playing with primary colors. So red, yellow, and blue, and then white and black. Those are Blackfoot colors. You know, we see those a lot on our lodges. And but I've really expanded that color spectrum to include the entire color wheel and playing with tints, tones, and shades. This is in 2022. This shape, you know, I've played with this polygon shape for a bit now, four-sided, but with circles inside of it. And throughout Montana, you know, whenever we were cruising to Great Falls or just anywhere on the plains, you see buttes, you know, throughout Montana. And a lot of them aren't this high like this, you know, a lot of them are more wide. But I like playing with that shape and either making it taller or wider. And they also remind me of structures, like a pyramid structure of some type. Um, and so that's what I started to play with and think about polygons. Polygons are anywhere from a three to an eight-sided shape that are enclosed. And so I really was thinking, I think, or I want to say right around this time is when I dived a little deeper into shapes. How do you describe shapes? What are shapes? And how shapes and color, when they're combined together, you know, they're very powerful and they can create um, new experiences and bring back, you know, recollections of old memories. So this is 1900, the date it was signed. In 2022, I got into the Santa Fe Indian Market, Santa Fe Indian Market, which is held every August here. They have a best of show, and I really wanted to think about how to, you know, what could submit and how could I play with scale when it comes to ledger drawings, because most ledger drawings are single sheets and they're smaller. And I started to think, well, maybe I can start combining sheets. And so this is a diptych ledger drawing. There are these two large Missoula County, Montana sheets that I used, that I had framed together as well, to create this window that to me like looks into the future. Black and white are such, stark, high contrast colors. And it just created this beautiful window. And this was my first time working in this manner where I'm using multiple sheets now, ledger sheets, and still colored pencil, black and white colored pencils. Really trying to keep these clean lines, clean work. To me, one reason I like to work in this geometric manner, not only because of cultural reasons, because of our painted lodges, but also personally, I feel it creates order, it creates balance. That's how it makes me feel seeing this clean work. And so I just wanted to share some of that. So 2022, and this work got first place in ledger drawing. And it's interesting because at the Santa Fe Indian Market, the guidelines, the definition of ledger drawing, it says is representational and figurative. And, this is obviously abstract and geometric. And so to me, that was just kind of some validation from the native community down here that what I'm doing, is good. The following year, I continued to push multiple sheets. And so this is a triptych, again, thinking about windows, thinking about home. I mean, my artwork, I live in Santa Fe now. I've been here since 2011, so over 10 years. And my artwork is what keeps me connected to my hometown of Browning, my reservation, the land, the Montana in general. And so to me, this really reminded me of home, and it's titled Heading Home, Where the Power of the World Exists. And I heard that quote one time when I was watching a documentary about Blackfoot being put up in Canada, and the person narrating the documentary had mentioned the where the power of the world exists. That just really stuck out to me. And to me, this piece represented that. And so I went with that title. As you can see, my titles are pretty long. I can go into that later if someone has questions about that, but I have a whole process to my titling. So this is a triptych. So I did three pieces here, 1914, and this piece got first that year too. And I entered this for my best of show. So I take that opportunity to really push myself artistically. This is another photo by Walter McClintock. This is called the Big Rock Lodge. And I love rocks. I've always been inspired by rocks. Browning, we face the Rocky Mountains, which is Glacier National Park. That is our traditional territory. And I've just, I love that view. I miss that view. I'm happy that Santa Fe is surrounded by mountains. But yes, I love rocks and I love mountains and just learning about them and how Blackfoot people, Blackfeet people, we're super connected to rocks. There's a lot of stories and guidance, and even Napi encounters a big rock. And so this is a big rock lodge. That's what that is in the middle right there. That's a huge rock. And on the going around it at the bottom is the mountain symbol. And this has just always inspired me because we see these big rocks out on the landscape. And what I've come to learn is that, a lot of these huge rocks, especially the one to the left here, they're referred to as glacial erratics. And they got pushed out onto the plains. Some of these rocks came from Alberta, and they cruised on glaciers as they grew, and then as they receded during the last ice age, they were left spotted throughout the plains. And every time I'm home, I see these rocks. I try to make it a point to stop and go over, take a picture, go roam around them, touch them, whatever I can, because they're just so special and alive to me. And then on the right here, we have Rock City, which is at the southeast part of our reservation, just off of it. And you get all these beautiful hoodoos. And that is another special place for Blackfoot people and specifically us in Blackfeet, Piikani. So, these I wanted to include these because they inspire my work. This is that big rock. This is a big rock. This is near Heart Butte on the left photo, and then the other one is near Valier, sort of. But I really like rocks, and so I started to think about them and research them. And this is a ledger drawing I came up with that was inspired by all of these rocks. And I titled it Glacially Deposited Big Rock. Um, when I'm looking into these histories, I'm often looking up definitions, looking at the thesaurus, and that's kind of what helps also guide the titling of these names. And so when I was looking at these glacial erratics, they're glacially deposited big rocks. And so that's what this is, black and white, some of my favorite colors put together and really trying to create this large piece of shape that is taking up space. And so that was 2023 when I started to really dive into rocks. And this was a solo exhibition I had at the Glacier Art Museum, formerly known as the Hockaday Museum of Art in Kalispell, Montana. Part of that specific mural, and you chose to do our mountain design, playing with color, playing with polka dots, very similar to that 2018 show the mural I showed you in the earlier in the presentation. This one is titled Layered in Land and Cosmo Experiences. Montana, where we live, it's just this vast view of the plains, vast view of the mountains, and vast view of the sky. And when you're there, you just, for myself, and I know for other people too, you just feel so connected to all of that, and so I guess just privileged to that we still live in our same area. We never were pushed to a whole nother new foreign area. Our land base got smaller, but we're still in our traditional homeland. And so I really wanted to express some of that and share some of that at this Kalispell Museum. And that's what some of this work is there. And as I get closer to the end of my presentation here, I continue to add multiple sheets. So this was in 2024. There is order and balance in creating the unseen. As artists, for especially someone myself who's working with geometric abstraction, we're creating the unknown and the unseen. And that's what's special about an artist. You're a human being creating these things that someone might otherwise not see. Of course, I'm inspired by various things. This was very much inspired by op art, minimalism, and again, playing with black and white. This piece, though, this was my largest ledger drawing I did, that's framed all together, but it got second place that year. It was entered. So it's really interesting. The landscape works have all got first, and then this which is a much portrait size, orientation. And I thought it was really great, but uh, different response. So it's always interesting how people respond to the work. And then work that I've been doing this year. So this is 2025, important ideas come into existence. I really was looking at rectangles and squares and playing with that shape. And I started to think about monochromatic. And so just using one color, but various tints of it. And so this is white and some of these really light grays, but trying to keep the color scheme very close to each other, very monochromatic. And so this is what one piece I was able to create. I think it's one of my favorite pieces too, just because it is all white and that you can still see underneath it. And so the direction this is in terms of monochromatic, using only one color scheme, I has been started. I started doing that a lot more this year and last year. And then this is the piece I entered at the Santa Fe Indian Market Best of Show this year. It's a triptych. It's all concentric rings. circles. When I'm creating these works, I don't really know what the work is yet until it's finished. And then I start my titles, and then it reveals itself to me. So after finishing this work and photographing it and sitting with it, it reminded me of our origin story. It reminded me of the sun, moon, morning star. It reminded me of these, um, I don't know, I titled it Supreme Beings Provide Guidance. It's these visual interpretations of these higher beings than us, and they're all together, and all together they create harmony. And so this is a triptych ledger, and in the middle of each one, so the one on the left is white, the one on the middle is gray, and then black on the right. So I went with the grayscale. That's what connects all three and unifies them. And then the rings outside of that, I chose warm, cool, warm, cool. And so most of the time, my color schemes are like that. They're a cool color, then a warm color, then a cool color. Um, and all of these colors are different. And so I'm trying to use a different color when I'm working on one piece. And lastly, this is my largest work I've done. It's titled Another Human Being Experience. It's a quadriptych ledger drawing, but it's three sets. So each row its own artwork. All of them include another human being experience. That's the title of each of them, but the subtitle that individualizes them and makes them unique are below that. And so the top row is titled Magnificent Cosmic Source of Life. The middle row is Return of the Unseen to Offer Guidance. And the bottom row is Powerful Gifts were given to persevere. This work was really inspired by the Transcendental Painting Group of New Mexico. They were created in the 1950s, I believe it was, and they were primarily in Santa Fe and New Mexico. They were very much interested in spirituality and elevating artworks and thinking about spiritual experiences. And so I was commissioned to create this piece for the 12th International Site Santa Fe biannual show here in Santa Fe. It includes over 80 artists, mostly international. And I got invited to be a part of that. And I'm so happy to be a part of that and to represent Piikani, Blackfeet people, Indigenous people, because this is, it's a very I would consider like an accolade of mine to be included in such a prestigious big show here in Santa Fe. And so here's an installation shot. The work installed, they're framed all individually. And again, like I said, it was inspired by this Transcendental Painting Group out of New Mexico. And I was just thinking about direction, like so you can either look at the work as ascending or descending. It's either going up or down for me using those shapes. And the top row, I went with tints. That's why it's so light colors. The middle row, I went with tones. So this gray range. And then the bottom row, I went with shades. So tints, tones, and shades, color schemes. And you can tell in the middle of the top row, that circle, it's all yellow. The middle one, that semicircle is all blue. And then at the bottom, the other semicircle is all red. So that's what unifies each set. Um, Thank you guys for listening to me today. It's been a pleasure to explain some of my work and my connections and how I stay connected to my community. This is my website, my Instagram, and my Facebook. Those are great ways to sort of keep up with me. And just going back to, looking at the phrases I had in the beginning, that's my creative journey so far. It's still happening. I'm still exploring new ideas, playing with color and shape in different ways, but still trying to keep it connected to my community, to my culture, to our history, and the geometric abstraction. I'm really playing with this new way of interpreting, maybe even reinterpreting, land, cosmos, and even experiences now. So the, going on a hike and that experience you have, I've tried to incorporate that into the work somehow too. So those are some just other things that help me continue to create work. But thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Taryn. We have some questions. And so here's two questions. One is, have you ever thought of angling the paper 45, 60, 80 degrees? And then Janine wants to know about your process for coming up with the titles of the artwork.
Sorry, Carla, could you repeat that first question? I heard the second question.
Yeah, so Christopher was asking if you ever thought of angling your papers 45, 60, or 80 degrees.
Oh, okay. I haven't. Most of the time, it's just portrait or landscape orientations. One thing I'm getting ready to explore though, because I'm using multiple sheets now, and before they were all framed together, but as that last piece, you could see I'm individually framing them, and so I've always been inspired or like yeah, just into Tetris, and I've seen artworks where they're framed like maybe there's eight of them and they're in a row, but then like two of them are stacked on top of that one at an end. So I'm trying to, that's one thing I want to explore is when it comes to installing an artwork, playing with the layout of it. But I haven't turned the papers, at an angle. So yeah. And then the other question, what was?
Like your process for coming up with titles.
Yeah, so I finish an artwork, um, and I photograph it and then I edit it. And once all of that is done, I sit with it on my computer and then I just start to, I have an example here. I just start to write down any term that comes to mind for that particular work or that series. And so for this one, I recently did work for a show coming up, and it was three works. And so some of the terms I have written down for that during my titling process was color, powerful, abstract, satellite, balance, departing, primary colors, Montana. And then eventually I came to the titles of varying sources of connection. I start to puzzle together these terms. And so that's the process. Once I've exhausted so many terms, I start to stitch it together. And sometimes the titles can come quickly, or they just take so long. And I usually listen to calm music when I'm titling. There's a yeah, there's an album I like to listen to called Ambient One, and it really puts me in this sort of meditative state and helps me to think more clearer about the titling.
Thanks, Taryn. Asks, how has living in another landscape for so long contributed to your art rooted in home memory culture?
Yeah, no, so being in Santa Fe really exposed me to contemporary art and contemporary indigenous art. The II, they own the Museum of Contemporary Native Arts. It has a collection of over 8,000 contemporary artworks. Not, it doesn't focus on historic works. It's all from the 1960s to now. And my museum study background as a student worker, I worked in the collections, I worked with exhibitions, and so that really exposed me to natives that were doing artworks that aren't your traditional type artwork and really pushing boundaries of their cultures, innovative type works. And so I would say living in Santa Fe, and there's so many museums here, galleries, that has all influenced my work. And then the landscape, you can drive any direction and it changes here. That's what I love about Santa Fe is the landscape is so beautiful here. And then it's very diverse cultures, a lot of Spanish history down here. And so you think of how the natives down here were, their colonization and assimilation was different but similar because of different invading nations. And so that I'm always interested in learning about too.
Yeah, and we actually have a Blackfoot warrior story of our Blackfoot traveling down to Santa Fe. So, um, couple more questions here. Some folks were really interested in the ledger paper one. Where do you get the ledger paper at? And then can you tell us about the actual ledger paper, what that represents, the history behind that?
Yeah, so my father gave me some of my first ledger sheets, and he's collected it from various places. My father's Terrence Last Gun, and he's an artist, and he does painting and ledger drawings. And so he's the guy who encouraged me to kind of try ledger drawing. He always wanted me to give it a try, and so I just sat with that until the pandemic when I finally started to work with it. Since then, um, I've traded with people. People have seen that I am working with old documents and have gifted me paper. And then my dad has continued to give me paper too. So I've tried to look for it on my own. It's very hard. It's not easy to come by, but thankfully people see that I'm working with it and have gifted me or donated a full book or something to me. Maybe it's just sheets out of the book. And then the documents themselves, though, they vary. A lot of the earlier works are on tax documents, municipality, city, government. I don't know how people got their hands on those, but that's what I'm using and what I've gotten. Um, but other ones are like cattle records, tuberculin tests on cattle. New Mexico was really well known for a place that could cure tuberculosis. And so a lot of people were moving here. And then they also thought it was animals and cattle. And so that was in the early 1900s, 1930s. I have that kind of paper. I also have just regular notes, ranch notes, and accounting notes, cash notes, hotel records. So yeah, it's really depends. Mostly I'm interested in older documents rather than more newer ones. So ledger drawing, it started out with what they had at that time and being very, what is the word, resourceful and just using what you had. And today, I think it's the same thing, but artists are trying to still use those older documents so there's some differences in how it's evolved in terms of ledger art.
One last question, and then Josh can close us out for the day. But we have a question if climate change has been reflected in any of your work from an Indigenous perspective.
Um, when I first started out, especially with screen printing, because screen printing is associated with posters, and the history of posters is really like there's a lot of kind of what the political climate looks like today, and even the environment. And so back in the 2012, 13, all of those oil companies came on the Blackfeet Reservation, and basically the tribe leased out almost the entire reservation to three big oil companies. And that's when fracking was a huge thing. And so back then I was really interested in creating political type work. Um, and so that's what I was doing. I feel that's pretty standard though for students going to school and trying to do something very, I don't know, political like that. But since then, it's my work has shifted more towards um experiences and interpretations and history. I wouldn't say so much I've created something that's specifically responding to like climate change. So, yeah. It's
Thank
more like I'm more giving thanks and giving to the land, to the sky. I'm very much appreciative of land, landscapes, and how these buttes, mountains, mesas, they're very prominent structures on our land here, and that we should be very thankful for and protect those.
Mhm. Thank you, Terran, so much for the presentation today. Josh, do you want to close us out?
Yes, thank you so much, Carla, and thank you, Taryn. I learned so much. Really
Yeah.
appreciate you giving us some of your time and coming back to share your amazing artwork. I'm going to quick plug a couple, our last two. We're halfway through now officially. So next week, same time, Thursday at noon Mountain, we've got Dylan Running Crane, who's a musician, joining us. And then for our final on the 20th of November, we'll have Chris Latre, who is a writer. And so please come back. We've also got, you can watch all of these as well as our previous year's CIK playback on our YouTube channel. So we've got everything we've done in the past on the MT Engage YouTube channel, and we'll have this one up there as well. So thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next week. Thank you.